Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Richard Prum in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology and Director of the Franke program in Science and the Humanities. Welcome to this afternoon's lecture and discussion. I think the first thing I'd like to do is talk about mention some things that are upcoming. This is our first event of the semester, but on Tuesday, October 25, we'll be hosting a lecture by Frédéric Keck from the Musée de Quai Branly in Paris. He's an anthropologist that will be speaking about avian flu in Asia. So an anthropologist on flu. And then in Wednesday, November 30th, we'll have a lecture by Dr. Laura Martin of Harvard on such merciless war and of extermination, from Indian reservations to nature reservations, about the history of transition to natural lands in Native American communities. We also are still working on nailing down a date for Andrea Wolf, the author of a recent biography of Alexander von Humboldt. We hope to have that in middle November, a talk about her book, The Invention of Nature. But today, we will be presenting a series of speakers on the topic of the evolutionary roots of female orgasm, and to show that evolutionary biologists can learn from the humanities, we have a new format. We'll have a diverse set of people. Instead of the traditional single talk, we'll have a tag team talk from our presenters, and then a commentary discussion by another guest. So the talk will be given by Mihaela Pavličev and Gunter Wagner, and then that will be followed by commentary and by Elisabeth Lloyd. I will introduce our speakers, and then Elisabeth when she comes. Okay, so the speakers are Mihaela Pavličev, who's an assistant professor at the University of Cincinnati Department of Pediatrics. She received her PhD at the University of Vienna, did postdocs with Jim Chevroud at Washington University in St. Louis and Tom Hansen at Oslo. And she is now an assistant professor in pediatrics and has done a diversity of work on genetics and development and evolutionary biology at this nexus. The other presenter is Gunter Wagner, who is the Allison Richards Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology here at Yale in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and in the West Campus Institute for Systems Biology. He is also recently appointed a Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at Yale, and also adjunct professor of obstetrics and gynecology at Wayne State. So this is new directions for his research. So without further ado, I welcome Gunter, and is going to start the beginning of the talk. Let's welcome.
Okay, thank you, Rick. And I want to start for motivating why we are here and giving this talk. So, as I understand it, the Franke program in Science and Humanities has the task of actually bridging the ever-widening gulf between the humanities and the sciences. And I think there is no other area where humanities and the sciences, in particular biology, overlap more than in the area of human sexuality. To my untrained ears and eyes, a lot of the poetic, artistic, and musical production is in one way or the other connected to human sexuality. And of course, sexuality is also rooted in our biological nature, and so it's also a subject matter for biologists. And I think for that reason, I'm particularly grateful for the opportunity that we could talk here about our ideas on female orgasm and how that reflects on how we understand evolution in general. It turns out to be actually one of the best examples of how different perspectives to evolution relate. So thank you, Rick, for the opportunity to speak here, and Gary and the Frankes in particular for making this whole program possible. So here is our talk. Mihaela and I will talk about the evolutionary roots of female orgasm. And just to give you an idea, I will give you a little bit introduction to background. Why is female orgasm a mystery, at least for biologists? Modes of explanation of evolutionary biology that sort of are relevant to understand why we consider it a mystery, and then the actual core, the scientific facts will be presented by Mihaela, and we were actually now calling our model the vestigial homologue model of female orgasm. We'll talk about the physiology and the evolutionary homologues of female orgasm, and then in the end I will sort of say a few words about what it all means, sort of in a broader sense, before we then get the presentation by Lisa Lloyd. So in order to set this up, there are two facts that many people agree on, and they also sort of encapsulate why there's a problem in the explanation of female orgasm, and that's all inspired and documented by Lisa's book on the case of the female orgasm. First of all, female orgasm has no necessary role in reproduction. And also it's not strongly linked to intercourse. And that actually, this problem, the first one, is already going back to the very beginning of biological thinking, all the way to Aristotle. And you can find two areas in his writing where he reflects on the function or non-function of female orgasm. And, at the one hand, there is this book called The Generation of Animals, where he basically argues that, and the obvious fact that female orgasm is not necessary for a woman to have a baby, so therefore there is no necessary reproductive function of female orgasm. On the other hand, there is the book 10 in the Historia Animalium, where he sort of switches his position, and he theorizes that, you know, female secretions and male secretions need to mix in order for fertilization to happen, and therefore you get female secretions in orgasm as you get male secretions. And actually he reversed his opinion here. It's not entirely clear whether both books were actually both written by Aristotle and might reflect different authors, but that's at least the way it came down to us. And the second point, I know that Lisa will talk about it more extensively. Here's a quote out of the book that says, out of 27 independent studies, the rates of women who never have orgasm with intercourse range from 2% to 43%, with a mean of 12.5%. It's quite a substantial number of women apparently report never having had orgasm during intercourse. But for biology, this means how do we explain the existence of a trait that at the one hand has no obvious function and is highly variable in its occurrence. So it's not linked to some particular other thing that's going on. Now, at this point, I would want to make a very short sketch of different modes of evolutionary thinking that are relevant to the question of how we try to explain the existence of any trait. There are basically two forms of thinking. The one could be called functionalism, the other one structuralism. If you want to encapsulate what functionalism means, it's basically the idea that the functional role of a trait equals the reason for its existence. And the idea is that biological traits are brought about into existence by natural selection to perform a particular function. So if you think that that's the main way to explain the existence of a thing, you have to find the function first, and then you have basically explained what the trait is about. On the other hand, structuralism is the notion that evolution is actually the result of a complex history of opportunities and constraints, and the various choices, quote unquote, that were made in the natural history of this trait explains where it ended up. Let me say that there are certainly cases where functionalism really works, right? For instance, you can make a plausible argument that the white fur of the polar bear is explained by camouflage in a snowy environment, and maybe also with respect to heat radiation that is minimized by a white coat compared to a black or a brown coat. So that's a plausible story. I'm not going to challenge that. And other ones are, explanation of various beak shapes in the Darwin finches, for instance. So Peter and Rosemary Grant spent their whole life more or less explaining and reconstruction how climatic changes and seed availability leads to the evolution of different beak depths and shapes and so on. Okay, so that functionalism works, but functionalism doesn't work always, right? There are cases where functionalist explanations just don't get us anywhere. Obviously, feathers we find in birds. Lots of birds fly, and they need these feathers to fly. So does this mean that flight explains the origin of feathers? First of all, there are other ways of flying, right? So flight itself does not uniquely explain the origin of feathers. And my friend says, no way you can explain the origin of feathers, primarily because in order to come up with a complex structure like feathers, it has to go through a number of stages, one necessary before the other. Neither of these early stages can be useful in flight. So it is actually a history of events where there was a hollow tube evolving and then the bar breaches and so on and so on. I don't want to go into it. The main point is that the first stage of the evolution of the feather has certainly nothing to do with flight. So flight doesn't explain the origin of feathers. So we summarize this. Functionalism is most successful explaining modifications of existing structures, recent modifications, I would say, like shape of beaks or fur color, and is less successful in the origin of complex novel structures. Okay? So how does structuralism work? And this is less easy to sort of encapsulate in a small sentence. The way I think about it is that you have to find homologues of the character across species so that you have a chance of actually understanding the history. Then you try to defend the developmental or physiological core underlying all these realizations of the character. Then from that we can try to understand the origin of this physiological core, and then hopefully also understand the evolvability and the constraints of the character that it brings with it. So I have 2 slides or 3 slides on homology, because that's sort of the core concept that carries the structuralist approach. So at the most elementary level, homology is a very simple concept, right? You have 2 organisms and their corresponding body parts. That's what it is about. But it gets complicated if you actually do it in a more detailed way, and don't want to go into too much detail here because we don't have the time. Just want to quote a classical definition, namely a homologue is the same organ in different animals under every variety of form and function. That will be important for our model. Namely, the point that homology is not identity in the sense of complete, detailed similarity, but it is sameness in a way that I cannot explain here under every variety of form and function. Or, in other words, homologues change the function, they change their shape, and so homologues change and therefore are not absolutely identical. So, with that, I want to hand over to Mihaela, and she will explain the science behind this paper that we published this summer, and where we propose this, our model.
Works already. So good afternoon. Thank you for coming, and really thank you for the Franke program for organizing this. I think it's a very important topic that has probably had really not enough attention. That's why as you will see, we have so many questions still that are open. So I think I will start with the core idea first, and then go into the biology so that you can better understand why we come up with this claim. So our claim is that the female orgasm is a homologue of the neuro-endocrine reflex that actually induces ovulation in those species that need ovulation to be induced by copulation. And in a second part, we think that this function of this reflex was lost in those species which evolved spontaneous ovulation, which is what we have, for instance. And just to give you the background, of course, of why we think it's this way, this is the ovarian cycle. This is at the very basis of the female reproduction. And what it shows is really the release of the eggs from the ovary that happens in humans spontaneously. And what you see here is really simply the ovary during the folliculogenesis. Follicle actually has the egg in it, release into the female reproductive tract, which is what we call ovulation, and then this follicle turns into corpus luteum, which is a very ephemeral gland that produces a lot of progesterone for a while, and after that the whole thing starts again. However, not all of the animals have it this way. Some of them actually really need induction, and this induction can be environmental, it can be by copulation. To go a little bit more into detail of how this whole thing is regulated in species that have spontaneous ovulation, and it will really be a little bit detail, it's really regulated in the axis between the pituitary, which is in the brain, and the ovary. And what happens is that the ovary produces, as the follicle grows, produces estrogen, generates the signal in the pituitary that is triggered by the neurosecretion. Gonadotropin releasing hormone gets secreted here and triggers the secretion of the luteinizing hormone and follicular stimulation hormone, which cause then the ovulation. This is then reflected also in the way how our hormones are cycling during the month. So this would be the peak of the luteinizing hormone, and then you see the peak of the progesterone following from the corpus luteum, and the estrogen preceding it a little bit. Okay, so this is how it works in spontaneous ovulators in basically. That works a little bit different in copulation-induced ovulators, in that the same core is working, but what is inducing it is really the neural impulse that comes from tactile stimulation of the reproductive tract. So this is the core, and this is the stimulation. And then we have the same secretion of the hormones. We see that this happens really, really fast. So even within a half, this is the luteinizing hormone in rabbit, and if the copulation happens here, the peak of the hormone can be detected in serum within half an hour, which is really a fast reaction. So what I think is not at all trivial is that even though this is the system that we are using, orgasm actually projects neurally into the pituitary. Not only, but it does. And what you see here, it triggers the secretion of oxytocin, of luteinizing hormone, and of prolactin. And let us just look at the levels, and you will see that the level of oxytocin is not, the peak is not particularly high. So this is females and males, and orgasm is about this side. And these experiments are done on masturbating individuals. The same with luteinizing hormone, and this is only done in females. You see the peak. It seems there is a peak. It's not very high. However, prolactin peak is enormous. And what you see here are results of the experiments done on males and females, and they were done on coitus-induced orgasm as well as on masturbation-induced orgasm. And you see the orgasm happening here where the arrow is. I'm sorry for the not optimal resolution here. But it increases immensely. What you might misunderstand if you don't see the scale is that the levels in females are much, much higher than the levels in males. And if we show this really properly on the same scale, it looks like this. So it's really very different. The same thing has been shown in a different way with PET scans, where they've shown that female orgasm, but not male orgasm, actually trigger pituitary. It's important to know that all of the hormones that we've seen that are actually being secreted have, along with many other functions as the hormones usually have, they all have the function in the early ovarian cycle, so in the early post ovulatory phase, and prolactin actually has been found that in women the decrease of physiological levels of prolactin actually prolong the luteal phase of the shorten the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. And the same with oxytocin, has functions in supporting luteinization, and it also has a probably ancestral function in oviductal contractions that actually transport the egg down the oviduct. So I think that you know these observations are really not trivial, in the sense that if we think of female orgasm as we do very often in human females of the much more emotional part of it, there would be the part of the brain that is causing that would be the limbical part, limbical system, and not really the pituitary. And another thing that is important with this is that the surge is really very, very strongly female biased. So there's something about the female function of it. So given our thesis, we made with that relation we made two predictions. And so if the female orgasm is really the homologue of the neuro-endocrine reflex, then we would really expect that induced ovulation would have to predate, be older than the spontaneous ovulation. And secondly, if this function has been lost, then the change of genital anatomy might reflect this. And the way we went about this was twofold. So we started with trying to trace the characters on the phylogenetic tree. So just a very short intro into phylogenetic tree. What you see here are practically relationships between the single species. You can think of phylogenetic trees in the same way as you think about the pedigrees, for instance. So the closer the individual, the closer the connections, the more related the species are. These trees are put together by independent information than the trait that we are mapping onto them. So they are put together by information about molecular similarity, genetic similarity, and the fossil record. And what we mapped here onto this tree is the male-induced ovulation and spontaneous ovulation. So which species are represented by which characters is common in which species. And what we can infer from here is that the common ancestor here of the mammals, and we have the marsupials here, so the placental mammals, and is actually the green one, so the male-induced ovulation. This is why we are concluding that the male-induced ovulation is actually predating the spontaneous ovulation. The second part is an overview study of the female genital anatomy, And I must say I was very surprised how hard it was to find information. It's, you wouldn't believe it. Most of the anatomy books would treat the male system and then comment at the differences. That's as far as it goes usually. And so one point that I want to make here on the human female genital anatomy is just simply the number of orifices. So we have rectal, we have vaginal canal, and then we have urethra, so the opening of the bladder. And this is how I'll be showing it. So it's really the rectum, vagina, and the bladder, and the glans clitoris is usually associated with the opening of the urethra. So as you can see here, in primates and rodents, it's actually at a distance from vaginal opening. This is not at all the same in all species, and if we kind of use a little bit coarse classification, we can see three different types. One is a little bit more basal lineages have the cloaca, where all of the openings actually empty into. So we have rectum, we have urogenital sinus, which is a confluence practically of the bladder and the vagina. We have then this intermediate form where the rectum is already separated, but we still have the urogenital sinus. This is very, very spread. This is very widely spread situation. And you see the bladder still opening into urogenital sinus. And then the one that I mentioned before. One thing to mention is that to note here is that with this change in anatomy, the position of the glans clitoris changes. So it kind of travels from being very much inside to being very much outside of the vaginal canal. And if we then go back and map this distribution of the position of the clitoris onto the phylogeny, and this is the lower part, and then look at the distribution of ovulation, of the types of ovulation, we see that there is a pretty good correlation between the trees, meaning that most of the animals that have spontaneous ovulation have clitoris outside, and animals that have induced ovulation have clitoris on the inside, with, of course, some variation. I must also say it's a little bit hard to get the very reliable data for every single species. Species in the field are hard to determine what their kind of ovulation is. So one thing to say to that is, when Gunter started before talking about the absence of orgasm in so many women, you can easily see it's evolution. It's not pathology. Clitoris is on the outside. So it's maybe not so surprising that the orgasm is in the normal intercourse is actually rare, or rarer than one would expect. So this is really our model of evolution of ovulation with, I mentioned, environmental signal inducing ovulation, for instance, in fishes and frogs, and some remnant of it also later, where the ovulation can be induced by temperature, can be induced by photoperiod. Then we have this situation where copulation is what induces ovulation. And therefore, ovulation and copulation are very strongly coupled. And then we have this third case that we are talking about with spontaneous ovulation, where the copulation and ovulation get decoupled. But of course, every hypothesis, the real value of every hypothesis is what it does then for our questions or for our search for new knowledge. And we are now in the advantage that we have had a lot of discussions after this paper came out, and we have a lot of questions have crystallized. And one thing that we often get asked is so what drove the coevolution of anatomy and type of ovulation, right? And it's really interesting to think about what it could be. You could think about spontaneous ovulation evolving first, and then maybe the signal would actually be disadvantageous because it would interrupt the normal cycle. It might interrupt the pregnancy if the female ovulated in the middle. You could think about anatomy going first and followed by the spontaneous ovulation. Of course, once the signal becomes unreliable, that might be the case, that it's necessary. But I think that the third one is the one that I'm excited about looking into, and this is the simultaneous change. We know that development of the female and male, actually, genitals is very, very strongly affected by the hormonal environment of the mom. So if that changes, the genital morphology might change just along the way. Would be interesting to see. Another question is, of course, and those are many comments that we have gotten, is about the other aspects of really female orgasm and how do they play into picture, so human female. And I think that's really the topic that binds then back to what Gunter has already started to talk about, namely the homology. Identifying the homologous aspect, and that's for us was the endocrinology of a trait across species, is necessary to explain its origin. But it's very important to understand that this model does not even aspire to explain all the aspects of the female orgasm. There are many more in humans, probably, that evolved that cannot be explained by this model. And so one of them is of course looking into other neurological aspects and into really what is causing this connection to the pituitary in female orgasm. We know very little about it, but some we do. We know about the female orgasm and most of the research has actually been done on this part, is that it triggers limbic system. So all the emotional parts, all the other parts of it is triggered. We know a little bit less about what is actually triggering the pituitary, but there seems to be a negative effect of the noradrenergic connections that really inhibit the secretion of the dopamine. So dopamine gets secreted into the same part as the gonadotropin releasing hormone does, and it suppresses the production of prolactin. This is probably the reason why we get this prolactin peak after the orgasm. The norepinephrine actually suppresses the suppressor of the prolactin. So we know some part of it. We know for the induced ovulation, probably a different part of it. We know that it's also norepinephrine that works through the other neurosecretory cells that generate this pool of gonadotropin releasing hormone. So we see we have similarities, but the questions about limbic systems here and the question about the direct effects on pituitary here just haven't been answered yet. So in other words, the way I want to end this is really to say we don't have the information so far to answer the question to what extent other aspects have been are really similar. But to some extent, we don't even expect them to be, because a lot of what was common in the evolution between the two traits, the induction of the ovulation and the female orgasm, a lot of that has been changed in the species-specific modification. So with that, I'm going back to your slides, Gunter. Thank you.
So now I feel compelled to say a little bit that goes beyond the strict biology, because we are in the Witness Humanities Center. And so there are two aspects I want to mention. I know one of which is one that Mihaela already mentioned, and I know Lisa will talk more extensively about it, namely what it means, all the scenario for the understanding of female sexuality, in particular the variability of female orgasm in context of copulation. And the other, I think, also sort of philosophically interesting question is how should we think about a part of the female physiology that there seems to be useless in a certain sense, right? So there, as I has already said, I can just quickly, evolutionary changes to the anatomy of the external genitalia of females makes copulation-induced orgasm less likely because of the removal of the clitoris from the copulatory organ, which means that the lack of coital orgasm is a natural consequence of evolution, right? So that is something we really need to reflect on. And the other thing is, so what is the value and statements that are attached to apparently useless biological traits? And here we give a trigger warning. Maybe someone would be offended by that. But my thesis is that female orgasm, if you think of it as something that got liberated from its biological necessities, is actually a spiritual act. And we are not the first ones who actually proposed this. Mihaela found a quote on a blog by Slavoj Žižek, famous philosopher from Slovenia, by coincidence. And he wrote in this very blog entry that was in reaction to Lisa's book in 2005, is that the very superfluidity of female orgasm makes it all the more spiritual, right? We also got, after our paper was published, an email from Tony Bentley, who is a dancer and writer, and she got famous for a book also published in 2005 called Surrender. And I cannot actually quote from there, but one thing that was possible to put here is beyond control there is God, and of course she meant surrender in sexual intercourse, sexual encounter. So I think that is a perspective that is not only shared among us, but actually other people independently and before have already thought along those same lines, that decoupling a biological trait from its utilitarian necessities actually make them in a way much more interesting, in a way that it is spiritual, if you want. We also try to make a point independent of our own paper in an editorial that should be published in the same issue as our biology paper, where we write that one can think of female orgasm as a form of art, answering only to itself rather than to some utilitarian necessities, probably the most intimate form of art for an audience of one or two. And with that, I want to thank you all for your attention and patience, and I acknowledge no funding for this particular type of research. Thank you very much.
Well, my pleasure to introduce our commentator today. Elisabeth Lloyd is the Arnold and Maxine Tennis Chair of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Indiana. She's also adjunct professor in the Department of Philosophy, and affiliated faculty scholar at the Kinsey Institute for the Study of Sexual Research in Sex, Gender, and Reproduction, and adjunct faculty at the Center for the Integrative Study of Animal Behavior. at Indiana. Professor Lloyd studied at University of Colorado, at Harvard, and in Princeton, and she has done a diversity of work on evolutionary psychology, on levels of selection in evolutionary biology, on the intellectual structure of evolutionary biology itself, and more recently on adaptationism. But her role in this work has been furthered by her publication, both her early influence on literature by Stephen Gould and others, but her publication in 2005 of The Case of the Female Orgasm, which Gunter and Mihaela have already mentioned. That book made a incredibly strong critique of the adaptationist explanations for orgasm, and proposed and furthered the byproduct or fortunate accident perspective. So for her commentary, Elisabeth. You're up, sorry.
It's already, do I do this? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to comment. I'm delighted to be here, and it's a privilege to be commenting on such interesting work. I'm going to start by briefly reviewing some of the most prominent theories of the evolution of female orgasm, and I'm going to mention some evidence that's pertinent to the debate before getting into a detailed discussion of today's hypothesis. This question about orgasm is one with consequences, as has already been mentioned. For example, an evolutionary account of female orgasm is used to underpin the notion of a normal function of female orgasm for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the Psychiatric Profession, the DSM-4, and soon the DSM-5, by which sexual disorders are diagnosed. But in evolutionary science, there is no single accepted evolutionary account of female orgasm, and thus no notion of its normal function, if it has any at all. In my 2005 book, The Case of the Female Orgasm, I gave detailed examinations of all 21 published theories of how the trait had evolved. And all but one of them claimed that orgasm was an evolutionary adaptation. But examine this curve. This curve is represented by an x-axis of the overall orgasmic performance with heterosexual intercourse, and the y-axis represents the frequency to which women achieve that orgasm. It's a study of twins by Kydam Daywood and colleagues. Note that only about 13% of women actually always have orgasm from intercourse, and roughly a third of women rarely or never do, but at varying rates. With 13% of women, actually this is not the right representation of the data, 13% of women never have orgasm by any means at all. And these results conform well to with my study of 32 studies spanning 74 years. As you can see, this curve is basically flat. Simple selective forces, though, produce peaks in adaptive curves. And as more and more of the organisms in a population are selected to have the desirable form of a trait, which may be up here somewhere, if there's no selection acting on a particular trait, we may expect to see exactly what we get in the female orgasm case, a fairly flat distribution across all possible forms of the trait, from highly orgasmic to not orgasmic at all. The fact that women vary so widely in their orgasmic performance provides very suggestive evidence that every one of the selective explanations offered so far for female orgasm, no matter what their details are, is wrong. Each one of these adaptive explanations offered so far, except one that I'll tell you about, predicts a peak in this curve. But as you can see, there are no real peaks. Hence, nearly every one of the selective and adaptive explanations for female orgasm is undermined by the data from sexology. When we think about female orgasm, at first it seems perfectly obvious that the trait is an evolutionary adaptation. Common sense tells us that women who have orgasms will want to have more intercourse, and more intercourse leads to more babies. Thus, female orgasm seems to be an adaptation evolved through natural selection, which explains its presence in the population. Unfortunately, the basic premise of this explanation is not true. Women who have more orgasms do not have more intercourse, as Alfred Kinsey and his colleagues established in the 1950s and has been reconfirmed since. More importantly, women who have more orgasms do not seem to have more babies. And women who are more orgasmic do not have more desire to have sex. There's no correlation between how orgasmic a woman is and her having or wanting to have intercourse. So finally, Ziethen Santilla found a flat zero genetic correlation between orgasm and fitness. Not even a tiny suggestion of a connection between orgasm and fitness. Nothing. But also let's compare and briefly consider the adaptive pair bond approaches. These are variants of Desmond Morris's original pair bond explanation, and they accounted for 10 of the explanations I've investigated in my book. On such an account, the female orgasm evolved to reward the woman for participating in frequent intercourse, which itself was a way to, quote, cement the pair bond. And the pair bond is a more or less exclusive relationship with one male, claimed to be important for raising children and for participating in the raising of children and providing protection and sustenance for the woman and child. In them, orgasms occur reliably as her reward for participating in intercourse, which in turn occurs frequently to help cement the pair bond. So here's the status of the evidence for the pair bond account. Because this assumption or requirement that female orgasms occur totally reliably without intercourse as her reward, there are grave evidential problems with the 10 proposed pair bond accounts. They're not compatible with the sex research, either published at that time or since. Women do not reliably have orgasm with intercourse, as we've said, and as most adults know. So what drove the scientists into these flawed explanations? My conclusion is that there was an unconscious male-centered bias operating, for throughout the explanations, female response to intercourse was assumed to be the same as male response to intercourse. This unfounded and unconscious assumption has led many researchers to pursue misguided theories. Male-centered bias involves looking at things from an exclusively male point of view and subsequently neglecting a distinct treatment of a female point of view. In these scenarios, an autonomous or distinctly different female sexuality, which emerged so clearly from the sex research, is ignored, despite its high visibility at the time. A non-adaptive evolutionary explanation of female orgasm was offered by anthropologist Donald Simons in 1979. The basic idea is based on the development of the embryo. In males, orgasms are adaptations. They were actively selected for, but females get them for free, just like males get nipples for free. Now, you know we got the better end of that deal. In males, orgasms are adaptations. So this sort of explanation is called developmental or non-adaptive. Female orgasm is seen as a byproduct or of selection on male orgasm. It's easier to understand with a picture. So sorry about the explicit nature of the picture. I couldn't help it. Here you see the early embryo's genital tubercle at the top, which turns into the penis in the male. Wait. Okay, here we go. The penis in the male and the clitoris in the female. Note how hard it is to tell the difference between these two. These organs with common embryological origins are homologues, which is what was previously discussed. The tissues involved in orgasm for males and females are also homologues, including nerve tissues, erectile tissues, and muscle fibers. Thus, females get the functioning orgasmic tissues through this embryological connection and are often capable of having orgasms under the right conditions of rhythmic stimulation. So there's a variety of evidence supporting this byproduct account of female orgasm, although it's encountered a great deal of resistance. And I think that part of this is surely the byproduct name. Feminist sex guru Susie Bright commented that it made female orgasm sound like a can of Spam. So I'm in the process of renaming it the Fantastic Bonus Account. So Simon's account accords well with the data available about human sexuality. Strikingly, females masturbate through the direct stimulation of the clitoris, the homologous organ to the penis, and not through simulating intercourse, just as we would expect on the byproduct account. This theory also allows us to make sense of the otherwise puzzling data on the infrequency with which women experience orgasm with unassisted, or what I call no hands, intercourse. Simon's general thesis is also supported by the non-human primate evidence. Female stump-tailed macaques have been shown to have orgasms by hardwiring them up and to detect the orgasmic response, showing that they have the distinctive contractions and other bodily markers characteristic of orgasm. Note that Simons and I are not denying that the clitoris, as an organ of sensation, almost certainly has been under selection pressure because it aids the female in sexual excitement and induces and prepares her to go out and have intercourse. But this reasoning does not extend to the use of these same tissues for female orgasm. Orgasm is a special reflex that sometimes results from clitoral and genital excitement. General sexual excitement and the special reflex of orgasm are easily distinguished by most women, and just as easily distinguished by natural selection. Here is a summary of the evidence for the byproduct bonus account. But many evolutionists nevertheless believe, despite this evidence, that female orgasm is an adaptation, and most rely on a female choice theory of the trait, which is the only adaptive account that's compatible with the flat curve distribution. Let's take a look at the evidence for this female choice model, the current adaptive model being promoted today. The basic idea is that the female will mate with more than one male over a short period of time and have orgasm preferentially with the higher quality males. The assumption here is that orgasm is accompanied by a mechanism of uterine upsuck, sorry about the name, that makes it more likely that female will be fertilized by the higher quality male, thus leading her to higher fitness. Thus, the orgasmic women are required to respond conditionally. Yes to orgasm with higher quality males and no to orgasm with lower quality males. So this type of female choice selection scenario can theoretically produce a flat curve of trait variation like the one we see for orgasm, but only provided that the force of selection is strong. So I'd like to draw your attention to two aspects of this adaptive model. First, while the mechanism of uterine upsuck is commonly assumed by the female choice model, it has recently been declared devoid of evidence, supporting evidence by a top specialist in female sexuality and orgasm. So there's actually evidence against uterine upsuck through an old experiment. The upsuck hypothesis is nevertheless very widely believed by lay people, thanks to a deceptively narrated video on a nature show. There are also new data that bear directly on the feasibility of another key mechanism at stake in the female choice hypothesis, the conditionality of the female orgasm, which is important to the interesting hypothesis under consideration today. In a study published by neurophysiologist Kim Wallen and I, those women who reported orgasm with intercourse had significantly shorter distances between their urinary opening and their clitoris, seen here as the white bars, which appears on the slide as clitoral urinary meatus distance, or CUMD. We didn't realize the problem about the name until it was too late. Then did women who had longer distances between their clitoris and their urinary meatus, their urinary opening, and did not report orgasm with intercourse. So the difference was highly statistically significant between these two groups, greater than 2 standard deviations, and the R value for the combined sample was 0.6. We found that this anatomical distance was actually predictive of whether or not a woman had orgasm with intercourse. Clearly, if her anatomy so strongly influences whether or not she has orgasm with intercourse with a male, that leaves little room for the genetic quality of the male to influence the outcome of such intercourse. According to the theorists, the selection pressure of this type of selection stereo needs to be quite strong in order to produce any evidence for a result in terms of selection. Thus, the anatomical relation we discovered makes such a scenario nearly completely unfeasible. So the female choice hypothesis, the only adaptive account being actively pursued today, is facing very substantial theoretical and empirical hurdles before it can be accepted as a plausible theory of female orgasm. Now let's consider the fascinating new Pavličev and Wagner vestigial homologue model in the context of the other evolutionary explanations for female orgasm. We can see it as different in several ways. First, it is not a current adaptive account and hypothesizes that the trait is not a current adaptation, does not contribute to fitness today, which conforms very well with the evidence that we have today. What I noticed most strikingly, and which they discussed, is that the Pavličev and Wagner account concerns only a part or a segment of female orgasm. That is, it addresses the hormonal surges associated with female orgasms, some of them anyway, but not the characteristic muscular contractions or spinal reflex, which are usually defining a female orgasm itself. This incomplete aspect of the hypothesis will need to be addressed in the long run, or else this cannot be considered a full hypothesis concerning female orgasm, but rather one concerning hormonal surges upon the occasion of female orgasm itself. Thus, there is some work left to be done on the hypothesis in order to make it complete in this way, if so desired. Let me characterize then where I see the evidence today for the vestigial homologue model. Now, ordinarily, on my understanding, ovulation releases a large surge of luteinizing hormone, or LH. But they focus on different hormones, namely oxytocin and prolactin, which are released during orgasm. Although the research on oxytocin during orgasm leaves a lot to be desired. For example, it uses 400 times the naturally occurring dose of oxytocin in nature. One question then is whether there's also a surge of LH during orgasm. In addition, the world's expert in primate sexuality, Alan Dixon, has expressed a related worry to me in an email, and I share this concern for looking for increases in prolactin in spontaneous ovulators. where, according to Pavličev and Wagner hypothesis, it should show up. Is there evidence for this? Dixon, despite his encyclopedic knowledge of primate physiology, didn't know of any. Now, I didn't have room for this worry on the big slide, though, and I'm unsure about it, so it's not there. Now, these questions highlight, as they recognize, how much more research is needed into female sexuality in both primates and the mammals in general to test this hypothesis fully. This is one of my favorite things about the Pavličev and Wagner's hypothesis. It spurs on a wide variety of research into traits related to female sexuality and physiology and highlights the importance of knowing about them. There is still a question, also raised in correspondence by my co-author Kim Wallen, concerning the role of the clitoris, specifically whether reflex ovulation is triggered by clitoral, as they say, rather than cervical stimulation. This is also relevant to the issue of penis morphology in the species. If indeed it was the clitoris that's important to reflex ovulation, one would expect to see penis morphology evolve to stimulate the clitoris inside the vagina or wherever the clitoris is. But instead, only the distal region of the penis shows a lot of diversity across the mammals. This might indicate that stimulation of the vault of the vagina or the cervix, rather than the clitoris, is more likely to be important in induced ovulation. Thus, questions remain about what the role of the clitoris really has in ovulation, even in the reflex ovulation cases. And this has consequences for their hypothesis as a whole and might need to be investigated. More generally, it's very important to emphasize, as Pavličev and Wagner themselves do, that the female orgasm's hormonal surges are a vestige or byproduct of ancient properties of ovulation, whereas the original byproduct view says female orgasm is a byproduct of male orgasm. They both say that female orgasm is not an adaptation today, nor does it have a biological function, as was emphasized by Wagner. I'm not a believer in deriving social norms from biological findings, whether they're about adaptations or not, but it's simply a fact that people routinely do just that. In this light, the fantastic bonus account of orgasm, as well as the new vestigial homologue account, have distinct advantages over early accounts of female orgasm because they expect no particular adaptive set of responses to intercourse, and thus they privilege none. All women's orgasms are seen as equally expected and equally normal. None are couched in terms of their superior functionality, as in the bad old days of Masters and Johnson, when women who did not have orgasm with heterosexual intercourse were called dysfunctional. The two first theories I discussed are not actively being pursued to my knowledge today, except, well, the pair bond maybe is. And we've seen two grave problems with the female choice model, even though it is actively being pursued. But here we have a brand new theory involving the deep origins of mammalian female sexual response, one that highlights the role of the clitoris and its stimulation of the hormonal surges usually accompanying orgasm. In sum, nearly all applications of evolutionary biology to the issue of female orgasm have been problematic. Half of the theories offered failed due to androcentric assumptions and subsequent conflicts with the evidence, while the other half are faulty due to sloppy methodology and also conflict with the sexology findings. Only two, the fantastic bonus account and the new vestigial homologue account, are currently consistent with and supported by the available body of evidence. We're very lucky to have such a fascinating and provocative new hypothesis to spur on future research into the evolution of female sexuality and orgasm. Thank you very much for your attention today. I'm over here. You're on the right. just stole the clicker. I don't think that's mine.
Shall we?
Oh,
I mean, I completely agree with your assessment of the level of empirical knowledge that is relevant for our model to be correct. I completely agree with, as far as we could find out, nobody asked whether in induced ovulators the clitoris is actually the source of the neural impulse, and that is in principle, not easily, but knowable. But we don't know it. It's implied by
yes, the ignorance again. We don't know.
But you know, the way you ask the question is, of course, driven by the theory you have, right?
Yes.
So it's, I think that's a really nice effect of having a new theory, that we will ask questions now that we wouldn't otherwise, right?
Exactly. That's why I like your theory so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I have one comment about the luteinizing hormone not being present.
Yes.
You know, you might actually not want to have it present, because if you would still be, if luteinizing hormone was present, the orgasm would still cause ovulation. That means the intercourse would endanger pregnancy, would endanger so many things. So you know, it's
yeah. So it would have necessarily evolved out of the picture.
If that's the way, you know, if our theory is correct,
yes.
then I would almost predict that it shouldn't be there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. I think. And another thing about the morphology of penis, we have actually also discussed with Dr. Dixon.
Yes.
So if so you say if the clitoris is somewhere halfway in the vagina, for instance.
Yes.
And the penis morphology that changed is really at the tip of the penis that has the most variation, right?
Yeah.
So how does this correlate? First, I really don't know what the developmental penis might be of you know, how much you can vary
penis variation.
Morphology.
Yeah, penis variation.
But one thing that strikes me is that, of course, if the clitoris is at you know, at some midway through, then any tip of any morphology that would be changed at the tip would always pass it, right?
Well, depending on the thrust.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, depending on the thrust.
But rather than having the trigger on the cervix, right?
Depending on the thrust.
Yeah.
Depending on the thrust. If it's a thrust that is shallow, then it wouldn't necessarily stimulate it. But if a thrust is deep, then it would stimulate it.
Exactly.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it depends on, empirically on the situation that
Sure.
we don't know. Again, it highlights what we don't know.
Exactly.
And there are so many questions that are raised by your theory that highlight what we don't know about mammalian and primate sexuality. I think it's such a terrific theory that raises so many, that highlights all of these questions about male sexuality, about female sexuality, male penis structure, clitoral structure, all these questions that haven't been asked before and that we don't have the answers to because we just don't know. And nobody's investigated it. And that's one reason I think your theory is so fabulous, is that it highlights what we don't know and it gives an incentive for people to go out and look for the truth about these things. Yeah.
I also like to, in your account of the female choice theory, it means that, you know, by overcoming this theory, it's not only the woman that is not pathologized anymore, but it's also, you know, the male gets emancipated from the need to be able to cause orgasm during intercourse. Right? It's both, you know, males and females are victims of this functionalist account that then are, you know, labeled as pathological or inadequate.
Absolutely, yeah. If you're a male and you believe the female choice theory, if you're not going around giving orgasms to all the women, then there's something wrong with you.
I'm wondering, could you? Oh. I'm wondering if anybody could comment on the anecdotal relationship between female orgasm during copulation and pregnancy rates.
I will.
Yeah, can you?
Female, let me make sure I have this straight. Female orgasm rates and pregnancy rates.
Mm-hmm.
There's no correlation between female orgasm and pregnancy rates. When it was investigated, in fact, and people sought out to discover whether there was a correlation between female orgasm and pregnancy rates, and they discovered zero correlation, genetic correlation between pregnancy and offspring quality and quantity, offspring quantity, I correct myself, offspring quantity, and female orgasm.
I'm wondering if there's a possibility that both of those two hypotheses that you mentioned, like if there's some kind of combination of the two that might be even better than one of them on its own, and how you might go about, trying to test that, or if that's even something anyone's thinking about.
So if I may, so one unanswered question that we didn't discuss, so if in fact female orgasm, or let's say the physiological machinery that underlies orgasm, is a vestige, it became functionless, then the question is why it's still there, right? Because vestigial characters tend to get lost, or at least very much reduce in size and occurrence. And I think there the underlying biology of the byproduct theory can help us understand that, because it is still also in our model correct that there is this developmental homology between male genitalia and female external genitalia. And so you can make an argument that mutations that would further reduce, let's say, clitoris size and all the neuro-endocrine machinery attached to it would have a likely pleiotropic effect, negative effect on male sexual performance and reproductive success, so that even a woman that would have a mutation reducing her external genitalia probably would give birth to sons who themselves would have a lower fitness, and therefore the same mutation would likely to be get lost, right? So there are various ways in how these two hypotheses, or the biology underlying these two ways of thinking about it, can actually help each other.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, I was wondering about the characterization of humans as spontaneous ovulators, as opposed to maybe regular ovulators in the context of like a 28-day cycle.
As opposed to induced ovulation by the environment,
right,
or the male.
Right. But it's not exactly spontaneous, right? Because it does happen in a rhythm.
That's what we mean.
Yeah,
it's autonomous rhythm.
It's autonomous. It's internal rhythm.
It's independent, more or less right, independent of the environment. That's what it means, spontaneous.
Yeah, but the signal has to be there. Yeah.
And sorry, the second part to that being what the distribution of that is across the great apes in particular?
Are spontaneous ovulators.
All primates are spontaneous. So this transition happened probably very early in primate lineage, the transition to spontaneous ovulation, which actually also raises the question of why do we still have this orgasmic machinery still hanging around? Well, because of how many million years? 50 or whatever million years ago.
I'm wondering if, this question's for Elisabeth, how far back the studies go that measure the distance that you were talking about, the CUMD, that distance, because it seems like it could be more of a contemporary problem than like a problem of, or I guess an issue that, generations and thousands of years, or I just want to know like kind of the temporal significance of that study.
Yeah, our first data set is actually from the 1920s. The first data set is from the 1920s. The second data set is from the 1940s. So this wouldn't be a contemporary measure, actually. And because we don't believe there has been a lot of selection on these measures within the generations since then, we take these as representative today. We are interested in encouraging others to do contemporary measurements and do the surveys that are necessary to go with those measurements to determine the frequency of orgasm with intercourse. Thank you.
Yes, so you mentioned muscle contractions as being a part of every orgasm, but there's a part of orgasms that doesn't occur every time, which is female ejaculation, also known as squirting. And my question is, so at face value, this function seems homologous to the male anatomy. And my question is, in the vestigial homologue model that you're proposing, are there any other animals that exhibit female ejaculation upon orgasm?
I think we just don't know. When we know a lot about humans, because it's us, a little bit about old world monkeys, and female physiology in copulation has been studied very little, if at all, in most other mammals. So we just don't know, even how phylogenetically distributed these, reflexive contractions and so actually are, whether it's something that originated a long time ago or not. I mean, that would be really important to know in order to answer the question of how, besides the neuro-endocrine function that we are focused on, how broad the heritage from our common ancestors actually is. We just don't have the data, as far as I know, right?
No, most of our morphological data actually comes from the books from last century.
2 centuries ago.
2 centuries ago, actually, yeah. No. Yeah. So, yeah.
Hi, great talk, by the way. So I noticed in your diagram with the clitoris as it was moving out that the vaginal opening was also moving.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And so I was wondering if you were exploring other changes in female anatomy that were also driving movement of the clitoris.
I haven't, simply because the data is relatively coarse. But there is really a lab that we are kind of connected to that is working on changes in female genitalia in Florida, right? Cohen's lab is now looking into specifically the urogenital sinus and development of it. So one thing that I wanted to mention that I didn't afterwards, the urogenital sinus in human is a normal part of development. So and sometimes actually stays around. So it's really this later change in development happens in a kind of a similar way as it happens in evolution. Yeah.
Bioengineering.
Yeah, I have a question about Masters and Johnson. Dr. Lloyd, you mentioned that Masters and Johnson had talked about some women as dysfunctional, and I wondered if you had any other critique of Masters and Johnson, and also, would any of you like to comment on the legacy of Masters and Johnson?
I do have a critique of Masters and Johnson, a very specific one. They set out a normative process. They set out a descriptive process that was also normative of how sexual response worked in women, that described the process of penetration and response to intercourse with orgasm for normal women, healthy women, and women who didn't respond with orgasm to this intercourse were considered, they labeled dysfunctional. They did a lot of measurements on women having orgasms with intercourse and studied them extensively and portrayed these women as normal. But the way they chose the women for their studies, women were only allowed to be the subjects of their studies if they reliably had orgasm with intercourse. So these women represented, the way we figure it, about 8% of women. And those were the women that were studied as representing all women in sexual response in the Masters and Johnson study. So that's my critique of Masters and Johnson.
I actually have another question. So I know that concealed ovulation is something that's very specific to humans, or at least among the great apes. And I'm wondering if there's any relationship with concealed ovulation and orgasm. Does that make any sense, or do I need to ask it a little more specifically?
I mean,
I don't see it. I have a little bit of an opinion about the concealed ovulation, though.
Oh, okay,
yeah,
go ahead.
I wonder how much how much of it it's our interpretation by using objective measurements, because there are many studies showing that females actually act very, very different during the ovulatory time than otherwise, and that is actually a communication channel that we might not be capturing by objective measurements. It's obvious that it's not as obvious in many other species, so that's clear. But as far as correlation with orgasms or induced or type of ovulation, I don't know.
Do you know any studies?
Do you know any?
Sexological?
Between orgasm and ovulation, there are claims that women who are ovulating have more orgasms, but it hasn't really been backed up with any decent studies. In general, concealed ovulation is actually not uniquely human. It's the ancestral trait in the great apes. The chimpanzees are the evolved trait, not the ancestral trait. So the advertised ovulation that you get in chimps is the evolved trait. The ancestral trait is concealed ovulation, so-called concealed ovulation. As was pointed out, it's not all that concealed if you look for subtle cues. But our version of ovulation is the ancestral trait and not the evolved one.
Well, let's thank our speakers.
Thank you.